Today is week 3, and we're going to be talking about writing and editing your true crime story. Um, so most everybody here, what you're going to be writing is either your first article or your first complete book. And for that first article or book, you will not be writing and this is just my advice, but I would suggest that you don't write a book proposal. You just write the entire manuscript. You devote yourself to completing that entire manuscript, because at this point you're unproven, and the proposal, when you send it in, there's that expectation that you can complete an entire manuscript. And if you don't have that, it's kind of a catch-22, right? Like, if you don't have that behind you, they don't really believe that you could complete that. So that's why a proposal could get you in more trouble than it's worth. So I'm suggesting you just write the entire manuscript, and that's how I got started. You write it to completion, so that you can prove that you can in fact do this. If you come to a publisher, an editor, or an agent and say, hey, I want to write a story about this true crime, and you haven't been published before, the first thing that they're going to do is what they do for any debut author, which is to look at their socials and see what kind of following they have. Because even if they're unproven, if they have 1 million followers, they know that, if they sell 10% of that, that's still a wildly successful book. But none of us have that. The only way, if you can come to them with a complete manuscript, they will read your work, because they know that you've done a lot of the heavy lifting already, and this could be an easy sell for them. And if it's a compelling story, it really doesn't matter who wrote it. And that's the key, is to develop that sixth sense of finding a compelling story. And the best way to do that is just to find, if there's a particular story that you become kind of obsessed with, then already there is a story that will get its hooks into people like you. So that's a good story to dive into. The big question is, when do you go from, last week we talked about interviews and research. So when do you move from interviews and research to active writing? And generally what I like to do is to wait until I'm about 75%, where I have an idea, where I'm about 75% complete of the research involved, where I feel like I know most of this case, not all, but I can see what I still need to get, and it's mostly there. And at that point, it should feel like you're kind of lost in all the details, and you don't really know where to begin or how to organize it. You have all these questions, and that's actually a good place to be in. It's going to feel overwhelming because you can't really see the forest for the trees, or the trees for the forest, and that's when you know that you've got enough there to build a book around. And it's actually the writing process that's going to allow you to make sense of that greater story, the greater mystery, because it's going to force you to start organizing it into a narrative, into a story that makes sense to a reader that knows nothing about this case before. And while you do that, it's naturally going to bring up questions that maybe you hadn't thought about, because you're going to be kind of looking at it as you're writing through the lens of a potential reader, and they're going to have questions. And so it can actually help the rest, that last 25% of your research So that's where I'm at. Sometime around 75% of the way through, I start writing. And with the last couple books, and I think this is changing because I'm not doing it for the next couple, I don't think. The first couple books, Amy and the Maura Murray book, for those first two books, I had started a blog. I had a blog on the Amy Mihalovic case. I had a blog on the Maura Murray case, and I was using that to generate, every time I would do an interview, I would post it on the blog. Anytime I would find some new bit of information, a public records request, I would put it out there. So it's kind of already sharing it with the public, and it worked as kind of like a focus group, or readers of a first draft, where they would come at me with questions that I'd realized, oh, there's a hole in my reporting. I need to figure out what the answer is for this thing, and I found that to be very helpful. But that can also be problematic because you open it. You have to be very careful about not being too sensational. It opens, you can, by having that blog out there, you can become a target for some crazy people too. But with True Crime Addict, the book on the Maura Murray case, I did this. I waited until I was about 75% done with the research. I started writing, and that puts you in a very interesting predicament, because eventually your writing will catch up with where you are in the research. And if you've seen that movie Spaceballs, there's a moment in the movie where they find a video cassette of Spaceballs, the movie, and they plug it in and they watch it, and they begin watching themselves watching the movie, and it becomes very meta. And there's a moment in True Crime Addict where my my writing and reporting catches up with where I'm at in real life, and I write it in. And don't be afraid to do that, because it seems like that's what true crime publishers are liking at the moment. This writing yourself in as a character. 20 years ago, you'd hear this saying in the newsroom of newspapers where, readers don't want to know how the sausage is made. And for some reason that's changed. And readers do want to know how the sausage is made. They want to know how this story is affecting the author, the writer, why they're writing about it, why he or she or they are writing about this particular story. And it makes it much more personal. So the moment that there was a moment where I realized I had to start writing the Maura Murray book. And I had actually been researching this case. I started researching the case in 2011. And in 2013, I spent a little longer than I normally do. Spent about 2 years researching this case before I started writing the book. And the event that changed all that is when I was arrested and put in jail for contempt of court. So let me back up a little bit and tell you the story. My sister, so I have 4 sisters. They're all younger. I'm the oldest, and the second to youngest is my sister. Her name is Barb, and she lived in Lakewood, Ohio. And if you're from Northeast Ohio, Lakewood is kind of the place that everybody ends up after college. It's kind of like the in-between place. It's a very small suburb, but it's very packed with residents. There's houses, on top of each other, and there's just a lot of people living there, bars on every corner. And my sister Barb was about 21, 22 years old in 2013, and she's working as a server. She got this dog that was trouble from the start, and I told her it looked like a pit bull, but it technically wasn't a pit bull. It was just a big, mean-looking dog. It was the sweetest thing, but if you were to pass it on the sidewalk, you'd be scared. And one day, She was walking that dog, and along came a Chihuahua, and this giant dog went after it, and it didn't get it, but it was close. And the woman who was walking this Chihuahua uh, called the city and got the animal control people involved. And they sent out this young man, couldn't have been more than 22, 23 years old himself. And his job was he cited her with, failure to control her dog. And she had to schedule this court date to go in front of the judge. Now, leading up to the court date, this animal control officer fell in love with my sister and started stalking her and showing up at the house uninvited. And every time he'd come up to the house, he'd talk his way into the little apartment, and he was walking around, and he'd walk through the apartment, his excuse was, well, I just want to make sure everything's safe for both you and the dog. But in my mind, I'm thinking of Dennis Rader, right? Like the BTK killer, who was an animal control officer and would use his job in order to case homes of potential victims. And so this all led to one day she went out of her apartment and she finds this guy in her backyard. And he gets all flustered and she's like, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I was walking my dog. I live nearby, and I figured while I was in the area, I'd just check up and make sure everything was okay." Now, she called me after that finally and told me what was going on. And I looked into it because he said he lived in the neighborhood, and he did not. He lived 2 towns away. So now I know this is a serious issue. So she has to go in front of the judge in a couple days. And I went with her into Lakewood, and Lakewood is, they had this judge who had been judge for like 30 years. He was pushing 70s, and Judge Carroll was his name. And you get in trouble in Lakewood, you have to go in front of Judge Carroll. And I showed up for court, and I kind of look like a lawyer. I don't mean to, but I was dressed nicely and I had my satchel, like lawyers carry. And he called Barb up, and the animal control officer who was stalking her was the witness, and he was already like sitting in the witness box. And so when Barb went up, I stood up and I said, "Judge, there's something about this case that's going on that you should know about." And he looked at me, he said, Are you her lawyer?" I said, No, I'm her older brother. But this case is a little weird, and you should know what's going on here. And he said, "Well, if you're not her lawyer, I don't want you to say another word." And I said, "I understand how all this works." I said, I'm a reporter. I've covered courts before. There's just, I got to tell you what's going on here, because it has something to do with the case. And he started getting really mad. He's like, "You cannot say anything. You're not her lawyer." And we went back and forth a couple of times. And finally he said, "Look, if you say one more word, I'm going to find you in contempt." And so I had, 2013, I had some substance abuse problems and anger issues. And so I went through my Rolodex of Cleveland history, because working as a reporter in Cleveland for about 10 years, you kind of get to know everybody's secrets, especially, elected officials. And so, when he said, "If you say one more word, I'm going to find you in contempt," what I said was, "Judge, you're nothing but a drunk." And I turned my back on him and walked out the door. Now, I got 2 feet into the hallway, and I feel somebody grab me from behind. And I think it's the animal protection guy, right? And so I grab his arm, and I don't know where the strength came from, because I don't work out. And I grab his arm and I toss him over my shoulder, and he lands on the floor. And that's when I realize it's the court police officer. And he jumps up and pulls out his taser, and I put my arms up, and we're in this hallway, and there's one other person in the hallway, and it's this woman who showed up to pay a parking ticket. And I look to her as he's handcuffing me, And I say, I said, can I have your name? Because I'm gonna need you as a witness to what happened here. And she just sat there and shook her head. And so I was arrested. I got contempt of court for saying that to the judge. And it was normally with contempt of court, they put you in jail for a couple hours. He sentenced me to 10 days. I ended up getting charged with felonious assault on a police officer, which carries a possible prison sentence of 8 years. And so I was in a lot of trouble. I had some time to think about it in jail while I was stewing. And they let me out after 5 days. And when I got out, now I had to track down that woman that was, first of all, I had to get a lawyer, right? And the first thing I told him, I'm like, there's got to be video from that hallway that shows him jumping me before I knew who he was. And I was acting in self-defense because I had no idea. I thought I was being attacked. If I knew it was a police officer, I never would have done that. So we go to the Lakewood Police Department and they're like, funniest thing, our camera in that hallway it wasn't recording. And we said, well, what about the witness that was in the hallway? And they're like, well, how would we even know how to find her? So what I did, and this is another one of those thinking outside the box things out of necessity, was I went to the Lakewood docket and I looked at everybody that was at court that day, and it's a list of like 150 people. And then I went to Facebook and checked all those names against Facebook profiles, and that's how I found the woman. And we sent a private investigator over to get her statement. She said, yes, absolutely, I saw the whole thing. This cop jumped him out of nowhere. And it looked to me like he was defending himself. So once we had that, they dropped that felony charge, thank God. And I just got stuck with the contempt of court for being a jerk. But which is a weird story, but a long way of saying it was that moment in my life where I realized I had to kind of change everything that I was doing. And one of the things I had to change was I had to stop researching this case that was going nowhere, the Maura Murray case. I could keep researching it, keep finding new clues forever, but it was never going to really end. Also, when you're charged with things like that, it becomes a necessity to try to find a little money to cover court costs and things like that. So it was time to stop researching and start writing something that could be published. And that's when I really started writing True Crime Addict. And I put that whole scene in the book, where my research catches up with my writing is that scene. And it worked very well in talking about, how I let myself get so absorbed with this mystery and kind of lost in what I was doing. So don't be afraid to get personal, and you need to understand when the research needs to stop, even if you're not going to find an answer, even if you're not going to solve the case. You need to produce something to so that all your work up to that point isn't for nothing. So let's talk about routine. As a writer, you need to have a routine. You can't just write whenever you find a spare moment in your week and hope that you can make it work like that. You have to make progress every day. You have to write every day, and that means for me it's 365 days a year. And you should want that. It should feel kind of like a compulsion, even if and that means, like, no matter how small. Some days, if you can just write a couple paragraphs, at least you've produced something. You should be committing to this like an addiction, like a religion. And you should be thinking about story as you fall asleep. I've always found that a very nice way to fall asleep. I had trouble falling asleep as a kid, and what I would do is I would tell myself elaborate stories at night and drift off to sleep that way. And I would think up these novel ideas. And so get in, and that becomes a habit, so make that habit for yourself. And as you're falling asleep, start to think about how you might be structuring your story or how you could tell a particular part of that story. So you're making progress every day, and sometimes it'll feel like a push, and you don't want to write, you don't have any creative energy in you to write anything good. On those days, what I like to do is just enter data. And for instance, with some of these, with true crime, you're going to have police reports that detail specific interviews or facts of the case or how the police discovered the body. At the very least, you can do that. So on those days where you don't have those creative juices, enter in that data because you're going to use it somewhere. So write out that police report, and bit by bit, from the report itself into your own words. So at least you're getting something on paper. Yeah, don't worry about the quality at this point. You're not worried about, don't get hung up on, oh, that sentence doesn't feel right, it doesn't sound right. Don't worry about any of that. Don't even think about it. Get it on paper. We'll come back to it later. You need to figure out if you're a morning writer or a nighttime writer. At the beginning, when I started writing these books, I very much was a morning writer. I had a couple young kids, and I would send them off to school, and I would send my youngest to preschool, and she was in preschool for about 3 hours. 3 hours every day. And that would allow me that window because, I don't feel like you have to devote 8 hours a day to this thing. Try to find 2 hours every day, or an hour and a half to 2 hours. And that'll give you enough time to get into that frame of mind, that routine. It'll take you about 15 minutes. They say this in grade school, right? The teachers, if you know any teachers, they'll tell you, it'll take 15 minutes to get the kids in the zone where they're ready to learn and ready to hear me. And same thing with writing. It'll take you about 15 minutes before you get into that flow, and you'll know that you're there because time will fly by and you'll lose track of time. And 2 hours will feel like 5 minutes. Yes, this unsolved VA, it takes about 2 weeks to become a habit. That's probably true. I had a band director in middle school who said, to create a habit, you have to just do the same thing 21 times. So I'd say that's about right. Again, we're not worrying about quality at this point. We're dealing in quantity, and it should feel like what you're putting on the page is a lump of clay, and it doesn't have to look pretty. It doesn't even have to look like a form yet, because in the editing process, editing is where the art is. Editing is where you're going to turn that lump of clay into a beautiful sculpture of some sort. So what you're doing is just getting the words on the page. You're getting approximately where you want to be. And this time, we're at this point, we're all adults, and we're already in a routine with kids and spouses and jobs. So carving out 2 hours a day or 90 minutes a day, you're going to have to sacrifice something. And that could be time with your spouse at the end of the day. It could be the time you spend exercising. It could be the time you spend just vegging in the mornings. But there will be some sort of sacrifice, and it'll suck for a little bit, but then you'll get to just like people that get really into exercising every day, you start to enjoy I won't call it pain, but the discomfort a little bit. And so you're you're carving out that 90 minutes to 2 hours, and then you're going to do anything that your physical body desires in order to get the creative juices flowing. So that, tea, pamper yourself, right? Like get your tea, get your coffee, get your snack, get your music playing, whatever your fuel is. Because what's going to happen is you're going to find that even though you're just sitting down and you're organizing this research into a story, into a chapter, into an article, it's going to feel exhausting, which is weird because you might feel a little guilty about that because, like, what did I do? I just sat at a computer and typed. But I think it's probably you're using your brain in a way that most people don't get to do. And you are, even though you're not moving, you're spending a lot of energy. What I did is when I got really serious about writing books, I went to my wife, I went to Julie, and I said, because I was trying to figure out, I was just trying to write whenever I had empty time. And as a husband, as a father, somebody with a job, you're already filling that time with, working on, fixing a light switch or giving a kid a bath or something. That time will be filled. So where do you find that? And finally I went to her and I said, I think I can finish this book, but I need the mornings. I need until lunchtime. And then I will be at your beck and call. I will do anything, you need me to do around the house. I'll get the kids off in the morning, but I need, from the time I drop the kids off until lunch, to write and to research, or this is not going to happen. And she was very supportive of that. She's, it's okay. And that became the routine for years. And that was the time I carved away. So figure out what your routine's going to be. Is it going to be morning? Is it going to be evening? And figure out, have that conversation with your significant other, somebody that needs to cover for you. Let's talk about content of your writing. Here are the basics. Your manuscript or article needs to be in this format: Microsoft Word, 12-point times New Roman, double spaced, with your first line indented, and you're not giving yourself space extra space in between the paragraphs. This is something in the last 10 years with social media and Facebook posts and things like that. We like to write in blocks. We'll write a paragraph and then space, and then another block paragraph and then space. This is old school writing. No big spaces in between paragraphs. It's going to look like prose. You're going to indent your first lines. And if it's not Microsoft Word, 12-point times New Roman, double spaced with first line indented, you're going to send it to an agent and they're going to throw it in the bin. If it doesn't meet the basic minimum requirements for formatting, they're going to realize you're not serious. And yeah, it is a little like APA format, unsolved VA. So that's the basics. So you're also going to, when you're writing, the writing that's interesting, I'm trying to think of true crime books that don't do what I'm about to tell you, and I can't think of any. It's what separates true crime books and articles, long form articles, from just simple newspaper articles. And that's when you take the people that appear in the story, the victims, the families of the victims, the police, the suspects, and you give them 3 dimensions. Instead of, when you read a newspaper article, you're just getting, here's the person that was killed, here's the person that did it. And most of the time, you're not getting any sort of background on these people. It's just the facts. Here's what happened. To make it interesting, to make it a book that people want to read, you have to take these real people and make them into characters that that, you know, and I say characters, but they are real people, but you have to show us their three dimensions, you know, what makes them unique. And that's where I think a lot of the fun comes in with what we're doing here. And there's two types of people that I've come across. There's the people that are already interesting and you don't have to do much work. And then there are the people that appear, you know, just on the surface, it's hard to read them. But then in those cases, you have to dig deeper to find out what makes them unique and what their hopes and, you know, fears and dreams and all that are. The first one, one of the first stories I wrote for Scene was this article about a very interesting guy, and the article just wrote itself. It was this. I think I had heard about him from a friend of a friend. This guy named Mike Charlton, who was an ex-con living in East Cleveland, and he had robbed a convenience store and served a 4 to 10 year stretch at a prison around here, maybe Trumbull, and went to prison for many years. And he came out, and nothing was working as far as like getting him on the straight and narrow. He couldn't figure out how to be a decent, you know, human being. And so he realized what he needed was a hobby and something to take all of his time and effort, and something that made him unique. So what he did was he started to build a jet semi in his garage. He turned a semi truck into a jet. He managed to, you know, so you got to think about all the logistics behind that. How in the world do you find a jet engine? How do you purchase it as a citizen, especially as a convict? How do you then hook it up to the semi to make it go really fast? And so the process of all that took so much energy that he was able to stay out of trouble, because that was all he could do for years, was slowly chip away at this dream that he had. And so that made him a very interesting character. Just as an aside, for that story, I showed up at one of his events at this drag strip on the east side of Cuyahoga County, and just hoping to report on this. And when I showed up, he said, "Okay, hop in." And I ended up riding in the passenger seat in this jet semi that he was still kind of fiddling with. And right before we took off, and this semi would get from 0 to like 200 miles an hour in under like 6 seconds or something like that. And before we took off, he looked at me and he said, "Now, he's like, in order to stop before the end of the track, we have to use a parachute." He said, "But I'm not entirely sure I've figured it out yet." And then he hits the engine, and the whole thing starts shaking, and we take off. And we get to the end, near the end, and I see him reach down, and there's this, like, it looks like an emergency brake in a car, but it's what releases the parachute. And he grabbed it and he pulled, and he looks back and he says, "Oh, fuck." And the parachute didn't go off. And I'm thinking, we're going to die. And he was pumping the brakes, and the track actually turns at the end. And you're supposed to stop by then, but he was able to turn, and the forces of the turn slowed us down a little bit, and we didn't go off the track, but it was very, very close and very scary. But yeah, he made for a very interesting character without me having to do anything. Now there are some cases where you have to do a little digging, and the example I can think of for this is Amy Mihalovic. before I wrote a book about her in 2005, all we really knew about her as a person was her death, and we didn't know much about what she was like as a living 10-year-old girl. So I interviewed a lot of her friends, I tracked down her friends and family, and I was able to paint a more three-dimensional picture of this girl. And the fact that she loved cuddling on the couch with her friend Christy after school and watching reruns of the Monkees. That she liked to make these things called bologna boats in her oven. Her mother would put bologna on a cookie sheet and then put cheese on top of it, and you put it in the oven, and the heat causes it to roll into like taco shaped little bologna rolls. And that she was fighting with her mom at the time of her disappearance, that she was she developed all these emotions, and shortly before she was abducted, and it was she was butting heads. And and the most important thing that I found that really ironically says a lot about her is we know Amy from that missing poster, right? Like if you know the case, you've seen the poster of her with that side saddle ponytail, that 80s ponytail, and her school picture, and that's become iconic. Like if you think of Amy, if you know the case, you know that picture. Well, the funny thing is, that was the only day she wore her hair like that. Talking to friends and family, I learned that she wore her hair down. She hated that school picture. She would have hated to know that that's how we all see her. And because on the day that she got her school picture taken, she's like, she and I can see my daughter, who's now 10, doing the same thing, where she overthinks it, and she's like, I want to try something new. If it's a picture, I got to look a little different. I want to try something new. And she tried this ponytail, and then she hated it. And so kind of ironic that became how everybody sees her, because it's not how she saw herself. So remember, when you're writing about these people, what separates you from the daily newspaper reporter is you get to go deeper. You get to tell us what they're really about. You get to write them like a character. And it's important to remember everybody has a story. Everybody should be three-dimensional. And don't be afraid to talk about their faults there too. Again, I think about the Maura Murray case. We all know our faults. I was very upfront about, getting thrown in jail for contempt of court and acting stupid in a courtroom, which I would never do again. But we all make mistakes. Maura Murray made a lot of them. She committed credit card fraud. She got kicked out of West Point. But it makes her a more understandable human, certainly much more than the all-American, perfect to a fault girl that we had before that story. Here's another little trick, and something that I just recently learned, and I was doing this automatically, and I didn't understand why it was working, but now I do. And other writers do this, so it's not like a thing that I invented or anything. So here's the key. You got to let the reader discover information with you, because it's what's going to put your story in their head, and it's going to get stuck there forever, and they're going to talk about your book, and they're going to come back to it. Let me explain a little better. So there was this study that was not a study. It's something that is practiced in the Army and the CIA. They use this in what's called psyops. So they're it's psychological operations, and they use this when they're in enemy territory and they want to put something out in the media. They want to get something out there to get a certain response from the enemy in the media. It's propaganda, it's stuff like that. But what they discovered, the people that were working in psyops in the military, what they discovered is if you have a piece of information and you you write it in such a way that the reader discovers the information you want them to discover, instead of you telling them the information, it will have a dramatic impact on them. It will, you can use it for propaganda, you can use it to radicalize them. It will have an immediate impact. Think about the novels, think about stories from like Sherlock Holmes or Agatha Christie, these fiction mystery thrillers where you're in a closed setting, or like the Knives Out movies, where you're in a closed setting, you have the suspects around you, and you get the story from everybody. And just like the detective, the reader is presented with all the clues necessary to solve the case. Now, in Knives Out, Benoit Blanc, I think his name is, Blanc is the only one that's smart enough to take all those clues and suspects and time frames and details and put them into a narrative that fits, and therefore he figures out who the killer is. Well, the reader, if the reader's smart enough, they have all these clues too, and they can figure out the puzzle and figure out the one way in which everything makes sense and come to the conclusion, hopefully, a moment before Blanc in the movie figures it out. Because if you make the reader feel smart, if the reader goes, oh my God, I figured it out, they're going to feel that, and they're going to take that with them, and it's going to remind them of that story forever. So you should do the same thing on these true crime books, especially if it's a case that's solved. Let them lay out the mystery so that the reader can solve it just before the detective, if they want to, if they're smart enough. Right now I'm writing, I've already written the story about the Lisa Pruitt case that's coming out in June, and I do this in the book, and I've done it in a lot of books, but this one in particular. So let me give you just a little background. Lisa Pruitt was 16 years old. She was the girl who was stabbed to death behind a mansion in Shaker Heights in 1990. And this is the case where she was found 100 feet from her boyfriend's back door on the day he got out of the mental hospital, where he would write her letters saying, "Stay away from me when I get out. I don't want to kill you." And the next day after the murder, all of his friends went to the police and said, hey, it can't be our friend because he's a real good guy. It must be this weird kid in school who wears black and listens to Metallica. And they essentially hijacked this murder investigation, and the police went with it and eventually arrested and charged this kid, Kevin Young, with the crime. Thankfully, he was acquitted. But when you start looking at the case, and when I started building it out as a book, I'm trying to find the real killer there, just like the reader is probably doing when they're reading this thing. And so, I'm presenting it with the Lisa Pruitt book. We're going to get to structure here in a minute, but I'm jumping ahead a little bit. The Lisa Pruitt book is divided into thirds. The first third is the investigation, and it talks about, it's kind of from the point of view of the police as they're investigating the case. The second part is the trial, and it's this courtroom thriller and how everything was presented in court. And the third part is kind of what I call judgment, which is my reopening the case in present day. So in the investigation, I'm giving you what the police got. And what they came to discover is, one, they knew whoever killed Lisa Pruitt had to know she was sneaking out of the house to visit her boyfriend that night, because she was murdered around midnight. And she had made this plan with her boyfriend to sneak out of her house, and she was going to meet up with him in his backyard. And, they hadn't seen each other in like 2 months. They were going to have sex. And so it had to be somebody that knew she was coming over to this house, because that's where she was murdered. So the police started asking around, like, who knew that she was going to be there. And of course, the boyfriend knew. And he told just a limited number of people, a couple friends. And they all had alibis, so it couldn't have been them. One of his friends, though, was this guy named Tex Workman. And Tex went to Arabica Coffee House in Shaker Square that night. And that's where he bumped into Kevin Young, unfortunately. Kevin Young was that kid who wore black and listened to Metallica. And this is why the police considered him a likely suspect when all the kids came and said it must be him. Because when Tex saw Kevin at Arabica, he told Kevin that Lisa was sneaking out. And Kevin's like, oh yeah, that figures, that's, what would you expect? And so the police knew Kevin had that info too. Now in the police report, they get that information from the barista at the coffee shop. And he said, yeah. The only people here were Kevin and Tex, and they were talking about Lisa. The only other person was David Brannigan, this other kid who was waiting for his girlfriend. And so the police were like, oh, it's got to be Kevin. And went from there. So you get this little extra piece of information, this name, David Brannigan. And then it goes away. And the police forget about this guy. They forget that there was one other guy in the coffee shop that could have overheard that information. And I forgot about him. All the lawyers forgot about him until COVID happened. And I started going back through the records and I'm like, wait a second. If they're tracing everything back to this coffee shop, there's one other person here that could have overheard that conversation. And so the reader's tracking this all the time too. They have David's name, and they could have figured this out before I did. I went into David's background and found out that he is actually the only witness in a double homicide that occurred 5 doors north of where Lisa Pruitt was found in 1990. He also went to police the day after Lisa's murder and said, hey, I saw this, I was at a bus stop and I ran into this black guy, and he said that he was asking questions about Lisa Pruitt. I wonder if he might have murdered Lisa. So he was kind of setting up other suspects. So David Brannigan becomes the one common denominator in 3 murders. And suddenly I'm very interested in this guy. And I track him down and find out he was, I find an address in Twinsburg and I call up the number and I'm like, wow, if he answers the phone, what am I gonna say? Did you murder Lisa Pruitt? Or did you murder the Porters, 5 years before that? A woman answers the phone and identifies herself as his common law wife. They had a kid together, but they never got married, and said that David had died a couple years ago. He died in 2017. And I said, well, can I come talk to you? Because I have some questions. And she said, sure. So I went over, she invited me into her house, and I figured as soon as I asked her the biggest question, which is, do you think David Brannigan might have killed Lisa Pruitt? I figured she'd kick me out of her apartment, but she didn't. And what she said was, she stopped and she said, do I think David killed Lisa? She said, let me tell you this. She said, when David was in preschool, he told me the story about when he was in preschool. When he was in preschool, another boy pushed him down on the playground. And he didn't react. He didn't hit this kid. He didn't do anything about it until lunchtime. Mind you, he's 4 years old, preschool. At lunchtime, he sat next to this boy, and when the boy wasn't looking, he poured Comet cleaner in his sandwich. She said, do I think David Brannigan killed Lisa Pruitt? She said, I wouldn't doubt it. He's certainly capable of it, and I've thought the same thing for years. So that's how I think I found, the real killer there. So and I've written it in such a way where the reader should hopefully get to that information a page or two before I do. And it will allow them to feel that triumph, like they're actually doing something. So let's talk about, that's writing. Let's talk about structure a little bit. every book is going to have a different and unique structure. And when I talk about structure, I mean, how are you arranging the chapters? Little things like, are you numbering the chapters? Are you giving them a title? How do you divide your book into different parts, like I did with Lisa, where you have investigation, trial, judgment. The more you can organize it, I think the better the more relaxed your reader feels, because they can understand that structure and anticipate what's coming. When I write these true crime books, what I really like are short chapters that present some new information, answer some questions, but also raise some new questions, and end in some sort of small little cliffhanger. Doesn't have to be big, just something that raises a question or causes a moment of surprise that would lead them to have to read the next page. And that structure is the same structure as any novel written by Dan Brown. And that's one of the reasons the Da Vinci Code, I believe, became as popular as it did, because it was essentially a mystery novel on crack. Because once you got a little taste, once you started reading it, you could not put it down because of those short chapters ending in cliffhangers. You're like, well, I'll just read a little bit more, and then it would present a new question. You're like, okay, let me just get the answer, and then it just went on and on and on for the rest of it. So for every book I write, and I think I mentioned this before, I always have two books sitting on the desk as I'm writing. One of those books is for language and tone, and one of those books is for structure. And so I was thinking about the Da Vinci Code when I was writing some of these books. Now, what's interesting is, the structure that you choose doesn't necessarily have to come from other nonfiction. If you can, the story in some way dictates the structure that it wants. And once you think through and figure out the structure that you want, if you feel the story fit into that, then you've got the right thing. For instance, with the Amy Mihalovic book, of all things, it's the same structure as the story It by Stephen King. It's divided into 3 equal parts, and each part is separated by an interlude that gives you information that takes you away from the narrative, but it's something that helps the story along in some way. The True Crime Addict. I remember the editor came back. Here's the table of contents. Or the copy editor came back, and if you can see it, it's just they're short chapters, and each chapter is numbered, but it also has a title. So the first chapter's 1, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo; 2, Paramore; 3, Full Disclosure. And the copy editor's like, I can't find any other book that does that. And I realized that the structure I was copying, the other book that does that I had read, it's the Harry Potter books. And but what it does that's interesting, the Dark Tower books also do that. So something about fantasy. But what it does is the reader will skim this, and they'll get kind of a vague idea of where the whole book is going. And I keep the chapters kind of vague, but you get a sense of, oh, well, here's some, based on the title over here, I know something dramatic is happening. Oh, what's this? The Londonderry ping. What in the world does that mean? And it's part of what drives them to read more, is to figure out what in the world you're trying to say with the titles. So most people don't think the titles have that much impact, but they do. Right now, I got very lucky. After many years, I signed a contract a couple months ago where I've got this new book coming out in June, and the same publisher wants 2 more books. And this is the first book of a 2-book contract. And it's about my summer as a Boy Scout camp counselor, and in 1995. And one of the young men that was counselors with us ended up dead. So in some ways, it's kind of like an origin story and how I got interested in this sort of investigation. And it's also about the bigger picture of the Boy Scouts and how they are going through something similar to the Catholic Church, and the reckoning with sexual abuse and everything and all the fallout from that. So it's kind of a heavy thing, but let me show you how this is coming together. My deadline, they've given me till September to turn in a draft of this thing. And I'm about, you'll see about 7,500 words, which isn't much. I'm just at the beginning. But I figured out the structure after a while, and it's different. And here's what I'm doing. Each chapter, it goes back and forth between now and then. So I'm telling two narratives here. I'm telling about what's happening relatively now, what's happening in my life because of the repercussions of things that happened from the summer in 1995. And then, so it's quite personal there. So you're getting a narrative of what happened in 1995 against what's happening now. And it's working. It took me a while to get into it and going, but it's now and then. And I realized I had stolen that structure from another Stephen King story. If anybody's read Lisey's story that came out about 10 years ago, it's essentially the same structure. And because it works well for somebody in the present day ruminating about events that happened in the past, and showing how things echo through time. But here's another thing that I do that I think might be helpful for you as you're going along. So you'll see now I'm trying to organize these chapters. Remember, I said that there'll be times where you can't get anything creative, that you're just putting information on the page. You're transcribing police reports or something like that. Well, I also leave myself notes at the very end. So I know at some point, I want to get into the Boy Scouts bankruptcy case. I want to talk about this first aid class that I had with this counselor called Conley. When I first met Klingler, the guy that ended up dead, this event where my first week at camp, I was in charge of first aid, and a kid in one of the troops put wood on a campfire that was covered in poison ivy, and the kids breathed the smoke and got the poison ivy in their lungs and started having severe attacks. So I want to talk about that story. So as you're going along, you're also leaving yourself notes to almost like breadcrumbs to show you what comes next or where you want to go. And then you can just grab that and plug it in. So don't be afraid to, it doesn't have to look perfect. Just put junk on a page and slowly it's going to come together. Let me jump into the main screen again. Okay, there we go. Can we do speaker? No. Gallery. Let's just keep it like that. Okay, I saw there was a new message down here. Let me see how we're doing in the chats. Oh my God. Okay. Do I use book writing software? Just what I use is Microsoft Word, because that's what the editors want to read in the end. You can use anything you want as long as you're then putting it into Microsoft Word in that 12-point Times New Roman double-spaced format at the end. However you want to work at the beginning, fine, because it's all ugly. It's all just getting the information out there. But I got in the habit of working with Microsoft Word. Oh, like I said, a lot of creative choices you can make, but there are a couple unbreakable rules for true crime writing. The first one is you got to start off with the body, even if you're writing an article. And I remember one of my first editors at Scene telling me this, and I'm like, I didn't really believe him, and I tried different structures. It never works. And it's not going to keep your readers' attention because they want to know what they're reading and why they're reading it. So you're starting out with the body, unless you're writing about like a heist. You're starting out with the heist, whatever the crime is, a disappearance with the Maura Murray case. You start out with the crime. A jogger finding the body and thinking it's a mannequin. Maura Murray going missing on the side of a road. Amy Mihalovic getting abducted. You start off there, and it can just be a very short scene, but it sets everything else up. The second chapter is where you set up the stakes for both you and the reader. So what are the stakes? Are you setting out to solve this case? Do we know it's already solved, and we're reading towards some sort of conclusion? We know the conclusion is going to be there. What is this book going to be doing? That should be clear by the end of chapter 2. And you're shooting for this first draft should end up being around 90,000 words. So, and with editors and agents, and we're going to get into that next week, how to deal with agents and editors. They talk in word count, not page count. So you're shooting for 90,000 words. And here's why. Because now we're going to talk about editing for a little bit. And the first thing you're doing in editing is you're taking that first draft manuscript that's let's say 90,000 words, and you're going to cut 10% out of it, which is 9,000 words. You're going to get it down to 81,000 words. And that's the Stephen King rule. He's very influential in what I do. But I highly recommend reading Stephen King's On Writing if you haven't already. That's the rule he sets out there, and it works very, very well. And if you don't do it, it's going to end up happening later anyways. So that second draft is going to be minus 10% of what your first draft is. And it sounds like a lot, but it's not really, because what you're going to go through, you're going to realize I have a habit of doing this where I start a paragraph off and I'm doing kind of some throat clearing before I get to the point of what I want to try to say. You're getting rid of all that fluff, and you're just getting to the point of what you're saying in every paragraph, every chapter. You're just getting rid of all the extra stuff that doesn't need to be there. And that alone will get you probably to your 10% for that first draft. I feel like I'm getting the requirements for my senior thesis again. But it's pretty much, it's probably a little more work than a thesis. So you've got your first draft, and you've done your, and what I would suggest is you finish that first draft, you set it aside, do something else for 2 weeks, come back to it, do your editing, get it down by 10%. Now you have kind of a clean draft. You're not going to send it to your agent yet. You're going to send it to 3 readers. 2 of those readers should be avid readers, people that read, 3 or 4 books a month. And we all have friends like this. If not, go to your library and get into some sort of readers group. Find these people, because they will naturally, even if they're not great editors, they will instinctively know what works and what doesn't, because they've read so damn much. And if it's not working, it's going to click in their head, and they're not going to feel right. So 2 readers that are avid readers, and the 3rd reader should be not a friend, but an acquaintance, somebody that you know, but somebody that's not close enough to you that they don't care, that they don't want to hurt your feelings. You want somebody that is distant enough to give you real criticism. Preferably if you have any acquaintances that are English teachers or English professors, somebody in the, somebody that teaches, that edits, a journalist, somebody like that. And the meaner, the better. If you can find a cranky old copy editor, they're the best. And you give them all the book, you give it to them the same day. And you'll get their notes back around the same time, give them, 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks, and collect their notes. And what I do is I print them out. I go to Staples, even to this day. I print them out, I put them in binders. I got a bunch of old binders here, and I drive it out to them and give it to them. And inside the binder is a couple things. It's kind of a note on what I want the book to accomplish, a couple red pens, and some money. You should pay these people, not a whole lot, $100 goes a long way. Or take them out, give them a at the very least, give them a gift certificate to a restaurant or a cactus or something, but give them something. And then you collect the manuscripts back, and you have all their notes on red notes. And then you read through each of them, and then you compare them. Because if each of these 3 people gives you the same note and says, this is not working, if all 3 of them agree that this is not working, no matter how much you like that, it needs to go. Because every other reader that's going to read your book is going to get tripped up on that same thing. Even if they're wrong, even if this is better in a literary sense, it's not worth the trouble. So make that change. If they disagree, if 2 of them say one thing, the other says, no, this is working, then it's up to you. You make the decision on what you ultimately want to do. But really listen to that criticism and take it to heart. And it doesn't mean you're a bad writer, because the criticism is helping you develop a better book, which is a great thing. Then we get to the 3rd edit, and that 3rd edit happens with your agent. And agents over the last 20 or 30 years, have essentially taken the place of, the agents have kind of taken the place that editors used to have. Editors used to edit. Now it's mostly the agents that do the early editing. And your agent's going to come back with a bunch of notes. Now, you need to be passionate for your writing at that point. And agents don't necessarily come from a literary background. They can come from a business background. They can have a feeling for what makes a good book or what's a sellable book. And so their notes might not necessarily be helping the book itself. So take their criticism, but don't be afraid to stand up for your writing at that point. So take their notes, but be clear with what you want with your agent. Now the final edit, you're going to turn in a final manuscript to an editor. Now the editor is going to read it, and they're going to come back with notes. And with the editor, it's important. It's very opposite from editing from an agent standpoint, because when the editor comes back with notes, you should be amenable to those notes. You're going to, I would recommend, agree with 90% of their edits just on the face of things. You got to make 90%. You got to say, oh, 90% of the time they're right, even if you think they're wrong. The remaining 10% you can think about, but ultimately I would strongly suggest you do what they ask you to do if you want to do this for a living and make money at it, because they're the ones that control everything. And they also are coming at it from a literary background. the editors have that background. They know what good writing is, and you should trust them. Part of that relationship is about trust. And even if you don't understand completely why they want you to make that change, you should give them the trust that they know what they're doing. Which reminds me, the second novel I wrote was this thing called The Great Forgetting. And my first novel, when it was published in 2012, got me a deal with a publisher where they basically said, whatever your second book is, we want it. So it was like giving, all my life I've wanted to be a writer. And so it was like giving your kid the car keys and saying, go have fun. And so I did. And what I did was I turned in, remember I said you're shooting for 90,000 words for your first manuscript. What I gave them was 190,000 words. It was the size of Stephen King's The Stand. And I turned it into the editor, and she's like, nobody's going to read this. We don't publish things this big. It would require a special printer to do something like this. And you gotta edit this thing. So I spent the next year, and this is where I say you got to trust your editor, no matter how hard it hurts, because I cut 500 pages out of that book in order to get it published. And it was excruciating. But I wanted to do this for a living. I wanted to make money, and this was the only way to do it. So, maybe there's, and that's why, Stephen King with the Stand, when they published it, it was much shorter, and he wasn't, famous, and then he became famous, and he's like, well, now I want to publish the whole thing. So, maybe tell yourself that I'll keep the complete version on a shelf somewhere until I get uber famous, and then I'll try to publish it. Then people might read it. But yeah, that hurt. So and editing's going to be difficult like that. Yeah, and finally you're done with the final edit. Let it be. Celebrate turning in that final draft, smoke a stogie, take yourself on a little spa trip, or get your favorite candy bar, or some champagne, but do something to celebrate it, because it's a big deal. And yeah, so that is my thoughts on writing and editing true crime.